It was June 24th, 1945. Moscow was glittering, not with sunlight, with something rarer, relief. After 4 years of war that had consumed the lives of more than 27 million Soviet citizens, the streets of the capital were alive with weeping laughter and the low, thunderous roar of a crowd that had survived the unsurvivable. Red banners hung from every building, flowers carpeted the cobblestones, women held photographs of men who had never come home. And then he appeared. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov rode a white stallion through Red Square with the measured calm of a man who had stared down the entire German war machine and made it blink first. He was not performing, he was simply present. And the crowd erupted, not politely, not dutifully, with something raw and uncontrollable and real, the kind of love that cannot be manufactured, only earned. High above on the Lenin mausoleum, a man in a gray military coat watched all of this without expression. Joseph Stalin, the architect of the Soviet state, the man who called himself Generalissimo, the man who had, according to official history, won the war. He watched Zhukov on that white horse. He watched the crowd's reaction. And something inside him, something cold and ancient and calculating, filed it away. Exactly 1 year later, Georgy Zhukov would vanish from public life as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. This is the story of how that happened. But to understand why, we have to go back, far back, before the medals and the marble statues and the white horse. We have to go back to a place where there were no medals, no horses, and no reason for anyone to notice a boy named Georgy at all. A village that history forgot, Strelkovka. 1996, not the year, the village. A settlement so small, so removed from power and prestige that most maps of the Russian Empire didn't bother to include it. Located roughly 62 miles east of Moscow, Strelkovka was the kind of place where your father's fate defined your own before you could even speak. Georgy Zhukov was born there on December 1st, 1896, the son of Konstantin Zhukov, a cobbler, and Ustinya, a peasant laborer who, according to those who knew her, could carry grain sacks that would have buckled most men. The village had no library, no theater, no future worth speaking of. What it had were long winters, hard soil, and the unspoken understanding that some people were simply born to serve others. Zhukov attended a 3-year parish school. 3 years. That was the ceiling. That was all the empire believed boys like him required. Enough literacy to follow orders, not enough education to question them. When he graduated at 11 years old with a certificate of honors, it was the proudest moment his family had ever witnessed. It was also, by the logic of the world he had been born into, the last formal step forward he was allowed to take. His mother sent him to Moscow. The furrier's apprentice, Moscow, in the early 1900s, was 2 cities occupying the same space. One city belonged to industrialists, merchants, and aristocrats, men who ate in restaurants, wore tailored coats, and moved through the world as if it had been designed for their comfort. The other city, the real city, belonged to everyone else. 11-year-old Georgy Zhukov arrived in that second city and immediately went to work in his uncle's furrier workshop. He learned to cut and stretch animal hides. He learned to sew in the cold. He slept on the floor of the workshop because there was no separate place for an apprentice to sleep. His workday stretched to 12 hours and beyond. He was not being exploited. This was simply ordinary life for a boy of his class and origin. But here's the detail that history books rarely pause on long enough. He kept studying. At night, when the other workers collapsed into their pallets, Zhukov read. He attended evening classes whenever he could. He absorbed everything: history, mathematics, geography. Not because anyone told him to, not because there was a plan or a scholarship waiting for him at the end of it, but because something inside him refused to accept the ceiling that society had placed above his head. It was not ambition in the ordinary sense. Ambition implies a clear target. What Zhukov had was something more primal, a refusal, a quiet, steady refusal to become what the world expected of him. He could not have known that this refusal would one day reshape history. blood and the cross of St. George, and in 1915 the Russian Empire's military machinery reached down into the workshops and fields and took what it needed. Young men born in 1896 were called up. Georgy Zhukov, 19 years old, barely educated by any formal standard but sharp as a blade, was inducted into the cavalry of the Tsar's army. War, it turned out, was the first environment in his life where the rules of birth did not fully apply. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, where a man's value was measured in what he could do, not where he came from, Zhukov discovered something about himself. He did not freeze. While other men were paralyzed by the scale of what surrounded them, Zhukov processed it. He saw patterns in the movement of forces. He identified weaknesses before his superiors could articulate them. He led. He was wounded. He returned. He was decorated not once but twice with the Cross of St. George, the highest honor available to an enlisted soldier in the Imperial Russian Army. For a boy who had been sleeping on a furrier's floor 5 years earlier, this was extraordinary, but Zhukov did not experience it as extraordinary. He experienced it as confirmation of what he had always suspected, that he was capable of more than his birth had permitted him to expect. Then, in 1917, the empire that had both limited him and honored him collapsed entirely. The revolution did not give Zhukov ideology. He was never primarily a political man. What it gave him was something more valuable, an open road. In the new Soviet order, what mattered, at least in theory, was what a man could do. The Red Army needed officers. It was not concerned with your father's trade. It was concerned with your ability to win. Georgy Zhukov joined the Red Army. He was 21 years old. He had 3 years of primary education, calloused hands, 2 military crosses, and an absolute refusal to be anything other than what he was capable of being. It was enough. It was more than enough. The years of the purge, when staying invisible was the only strategy. By the mid-1930s, Zhukov had risen steadily through the ranks of the Red Army, not through politics, not through flattery, but through the consistent, relentless delivery of results. He was known as demanding, blunt, and at times brutal in his expectations. He did not comfort his subordinates. He trained them. He did not celebrate small victories. He studied his own mistakes with the same ruthlessness he applied to enemy weaknesses. In another country, in another system, he would have simply been a military professional building a career. But the Soviet Union in 1937 was not another country. It was something unique and terrifying in the history of human governance, a state in the process of devouring itself. Stalin's great purge swept through the Red Army like a wildfire through dry timber. 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals were shot. 13 of 15 army commanders were executed or arrested. 50 of 57 corps commanders were destroyed. The very men who had built the Soviet military, who understood its doctrine and its capability, were erased, not because they had betrayed the state, but because they had become visible enough to seem like threats. The mathematics of survival in those years were paradoxical and merciless. Being too celebrated meant being dangerous. Being too obscure meant being useless. The only safe position was a narrow, almost impossibly precise middle ground. Productive enough to be kept alive, quiet enough to be considered loyal. Zhukov found that middle ground. He was stationed away from Moscow. He focused on his work. He delivered results without making speeches. He was never a man who sought the spotlight for its own sake. He sought it only as a consequence of doing his job. And in the years of the purge, that instinct saved his life. All around him, men were dragged from their beds at 2 a.m. Families disappeared. Officers he had served beside for years were retroactively declared enemies of the state, their very names becoming forbidden words in conversation. Zhukov watched all of this. He said nothing. He continued working. This was not cowardice. It was the most sophisticated kind of courage. The courage to endure without breaking, to survive without compromising the core of who you are, to wait for the moment when survival would finally allow you to act. That moment arrived in 1939, Khalkhin Gol, the victory that changed everything. The name means almost nothing to most people today. Khalkhin Gol, a river in the middle of nowhere on the border between Outer Mongolia and Japanese-controlled Manchuria. In the summer of 1939, it was the site of a conflict that most of the world didn't notice, and history is largely forgotten. Zhukov arrived at the front in June. What he found was a Soviet force in crisis. The Japanese Kwantung Army, disciplined, experienced, and operating on home terrain, had been pressing Soviet and Mongolian units back. The local Soviet commanders were overwhelmed. The front was collapsing. Zhukov assessed the situation in days. He identified the problem not as a shortage of courage, but as a shortage of coordination. The Soviet forces were reacting, responding to Japanese moves rather than imposing their own. He immediately began to reorganize supply lines, bringing in fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements with a logistical intensity that stunned his staff. He worked 20-hour days. He demanded the same from everyone around him. On August 20th, 1939, Zhukov launched a coordinated three-pronged attack that enveloped the Japanese forces from both flanks while pinning them in the center. It was not improvised. It had been prepared with the kind of meticulous, patient precision that separated a military craftsman from a military artist. The encirclement was complete. Japanese casualties reached catastrophic levels. The Kwantung Army, which had never been decisively defeated before, was broken in a matter of days. The strategic consequences were enormous. Japan, which had been considering a northern expansion into Soviet territory, quietly shelved those plans. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union 2 years later, Japan did not join from the east. And this decision, born from the memory of Khalkhin Gol, may have been one of the decisive factors in the eventual Soviet survival. Zhukov received his first Gold Star as hero of the Soviet Union. Stalin promoted him to general of the army and summoned him to Moscow. The boy from Strelkovka, the furrier's apprentice who had slept on a workshop floor, was now standing in the Kremlin being received by the most powerful man in the Soviet state. Stalin needed him, and Stalin never forgave anyone he needed. The City That Could Not Fall, June 22nd, 1941. 4:15 in the morning, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, had begun. Stalin had been warned by his own intelligence services, by foreign governments, by defectors. He had dismissed every warning, interpreting them as provocations or disinformation designed to pull him into a premature conflict. When the attack came, he was so overwhelmed by the reality of his own miscalculation that he reportedly retreated to his dacha and could not be reached for days. The Red Army, decapitated by the purge and caught completely off guard, collapsed. In the first weeks of the war, the Soviet military suffered losses of a scale that defied comprehension. Entire armies were surrounded and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured. The Germans advanced with a speed and violence that seemed to confirm their own belief that the Soviet state was, as one German commander put it, a rotten house that only needed a kick to come crashing down. By October, the Germans were 40 miles from the Kremlin. In those nightmarish weeks when other commanders were paralyzed or retreating into silence, Zhukov was one of the few who continued to speak clearly. He told Stalin the truth, not the comfortable version, not the version that preserved Stalin's dignity, but the actual military reality on the ground. He demanded reserves. He insisted on strategic retreats when retreating was the only intelligent option. He argued with the supreme commander of the Soviet state in the Kremlin, knowing that men had been shot for far less. Stalin, in those desperate months, could not afford to shoot the one general who actually knew what he was doing. Zhukov was given command of the defense of Moscow. On December 5th, 1941, with German forces exhausted, overextended, and wholly unprepared for Russian winter, Zhukov launched a counteroffensive that drove the Wehrmacht back from the capital. It was the first major defeat the German military had suffered in the Second World War. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. It demonstrated that the Soviet Union was not a rotten house. It was a house with a man like Zhukov in it. The furrier's apprentice had saved Moscow, but saving Moscow meant becoming indispensable. And in the world of Joseph Stalin, being indispensable was only marginally safer than being expendable. The victory parade on that white horse was still 4 years away. The fall from grace was coming even faster than the triumph. September 13th, 1942. The meeting in Stalin's Kremlin office lasted less than an hour. But what was said in those few minutes, in the low, careful words exchanged between Zhukov, his fellow strategist Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, and the Supreme Commander, would determine the fate of 1 million soldiers, alter the course of the Second World War, and forge a victory so complete that it would reverberate through every history book written afterward. Stalingrad was dying. The city on the Volga, now bearing Stalin's own name, which made losing it twice as politically catastrophic, had become a charnel house. For months, German and Soviet forces had been locked in combat at ranges so close that the conflict had been reduced to room by room, staircase by staircase, rubble by rubble fighting. Men were dying for individual floors of factory buildings. Snipers ruled streets that had ceased to look like streets. The Soviet 62nd Army, commanded by the ferocious General Vasily Zhukov, was clinging to a strip of riverbank, sometimes less than 200 meters wide, resupplied at night across the Volga under constant German fire. Zhukov looked at all of this and did not see a disaster. He saw a trap, one he intended to spring. He had noticed something the Germans had not noticed about themselves. They had committed their best, most mobile forces into the center of the city, where those forces were being consumed by the grinding close-quarters battle. The flanks, the long, exposed lines stretching north and south of Stalingrad, were held by Romanian and Italian armies, allied forces that were poorly equipped, thinly spread, and psychologically unprepared for a major Soviet assault. Zhukov and Vasilevsky whispered the outline of the plan to each other as they left Stalin's office, careful not to let their voices carry. What they were sketching was not a reinforcement of the city. It was a double envelopment, a strategic pincer attack that would strike both flanks simultaneously, drive deep into the steppes, and link up behind the German Sixth Army, closing the ring completely. The plan was so bold it bordered on reckless. It required absolute secrecy. It required moving more than 1 million soldiers into position without German intelligence detecting the buildup. It required coordinating 3 separate Soviet army groups across hundreds of miles of frozen steppe, and it required the nerve to leave Stalingrad itself, the symbolic heart of the entire operation, still burning and contested while all of this was being prepared. Zhukov had all of it. The ring closes November 19th, 1942, 5:27 in the morning. The Soviet artillery opened fire. More than 3,500 guns fired simultaneously along the northern flank of the German position. The sound, by every account of those who survived it, was not a sound at all. It was a physical force, a wall of pressure that moved through the earth and air and rendered every other sensation irrelevant. 2 days later, the southern pincer struck. Within 5 days, the 2 Soviet thrusts had linked up at the town of Khalkhin. The German Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men at the peak of its strength, the backbone of the Wehrmacht's Eastern campaign, was surrounded. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding the encircled forces, radioed Hitler for permission to break out. Hitler refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to stand firm, promising relief that never came. The relief attempt, spearheaded by German tank forces under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was stopped cold by Soviet defenses Zhukov had anticipated and prepared for. For 73 days, the encircled German forces starved, froze, and fought. On February 2nd, 1943, Paulus, by then promoted by Hitler to Field Marshal, specifically because no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, in the hope that this honor would stiffen his resolve, surrendered. He was the first German Field Marshal to do so in the history of the German military. More than 90,000 men walked into Soviet captivity. The myth of German invincibility, already cracked at the gates of Moscow, was shattered completely and forever. The psychological impact on both sides was seismic. In Germany, 3 days of national mourning were declared. In the Soviet Union, it was the first moment since June 1941 that people allowed themselves to believe, truly believe, not just hope, that they might actually survive this war. And in Moscow, in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin accepted the congratulations of his officers. He did not notably go out of his way to ensure that Zhukov's name was prominently attached to the victory in the public announcements. This was not an accident. The geometry of fear to understand what was happening between Stalin and Zhukov during these years of triumph, you have to understand the particular psychology of absolute power. Stalin had built a system in which every success belonged to the state, and the state was Stalin. Every factory built, every harvest gathered, every victory won on the battlefield was, in the official narrative, an expression of the wisdom and will of the supreme commander. The generals and workers and soldiers were instruments. Stalin was the hand that moved them. This was not merely vanity, though vanity was certainly present. It was a structural requirement of the system. In a state built on one man's absolute authority, the existence of a second person with independent legitimacy, a person whom soldiers, officers, and ordinary citizens loved and trusted for their own reasons, was not just politically inconvenient. It was an existential threat to the entire architecture of power. Zhukov posed this threat more acutely than any other figure in the Soviet Union. He was not a politician. He could not be co-opted into the bureaucratic machinery of the Politburo in the way that rivals like Molotov or Beria could be managed. He was a soldier. And soldiers followed him not because the party told them to, but because they had watched him win. He argued with Stalin in staff meetings. He had done it before the war, and he continued to do it during the war. When Stalin proposed a strategy Zhukov believed was wrong, Zhukov said so, directly, without diplomatic cushioning, without the elaborate deference that characterized every other interaction in Stalin's orbit. Other generals heard the stories and could not believe it. A man who spoke to Stalin the way Zhukov spoke to Stalin should have been arrested within the week. He was not arrested because the war was still happening. And here was the terrible irony that neither man could escape. The war was the only thing keeping Zhukov alive. Every victory he won made him more beloved and therefore more dangerous. Every battle he fought brought the war closer to its end and closer to the moment when Stalin would no longer need him. Victory itself was the countdown timer. From Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin, the 3 years between Stalingrad and the final assault on Berlin were a continuous and almost unbroken chain of Soviet offensives, each one larger in scale and more sophisticated in execution than the last. In 1943, Zhukov was appointed Deputy Supreme Commander, the highest military rank in the Soviet Union below Stalin himself. That same year, he became the first field commander in the war to receive promotion to Marshal of the Soviet Union. He was present at every critical juncture. Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, where Soviet armor absorbed a massive German armored assault and then destroyed it. The liberation of Ukraine, the advance through Poland. At Kursk in July 1943, Zhukov had done something that no military commander on the Eastern Front had yet accomplished against the Germans. He had predicted the attack before it happened, prepared a defense specifically designed to absorb and exhaust it, and then launched a counteroffensive precisely when the German forces were at their most depleted. The result was not just a Soviet victory, but a permanent shift in the strategic balance of the Eastern Front. After Kursk, the Germans never mounted another major strategic offensive in the East. Every engagement from that point forward was a fighting retreat. The Soviet war machine, which in June 1941 had appeared on the verge of complete collapse, had become, under the leadership of men like Zhukov, one of the most formidable military organizations in human history. It learned from its failures with a speed and ruthlessness that no other army in the war could match. It developed its own doctrine of deep operations, simultaneous strikes at multiple points across enormous frontages, designed to collapse entire defensive systems rather than simply pushing through them at one point. It was Zhukov's kind of warfare. It had always been Zhukov's kind of warfare. The storms of April 16th, 1945, the Oder River, the last major natural barrier between the Soviet forces and Berlin, 50 miles away, the capital of the Third Reich. Zhukov commanded what was perhaps the greatest concentration of military force ever assembled in a single operation. 2.5 million soldiers, more than 6,000 tanks, more than 7,000 aircraft. Against them stood roughly 1 million German defenders, including, by the final weeks, boys of 15 and men of 60, the last remaining reserves of a nation that had been fighting for 6 years and bleeding for 3. The assault began with a decision that would later be criticized. Zhukov chose to use powerful searchlights to illuminate the German defenses in the pre-dawn darkness, blinding the defenders and guiding his tanks forward. The tactic in practice created as much confusion among the attacking Soviet forces as it did among the defenders. The illuminated dust and smoke of the bombardment reflected back, disorienting Soviet tank commanders. The Silo Heights, the ridge commanding the approach to Berlin, cost far more than anticipated. For 3 days, Soviet forces fought through layers of prepared German defenses at terrible cost. Zhukov's rival, Marshal Ivan Konev, advancing from the south, was making faster initial progress, and Stalin used this fact to apply pressure, encouraging the two marshals to race each other to Berlin, knowing that competition between his commanders served his political interests. Zhukov did not panic. He did not improvise wildly. He fed more force into the battle with the methodical intensity that had defined his entire career, and broke through. The Battle of Berlin itself lasted from April 23rd to May 2nd, 1945. Block by block, building by building, in a grotesque echo of Stalingrad, but with the roles now entirely reversed, Soviet forces tore through the city. On April 30th, with Soviet soldiers less than 500 meters from his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler ended his own life. On May 8, 1945, at 23 minutes past 10 in the evening, in a former Wehrmacht engineering school in the Berlin suburb of Karlshorst, German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and the commanders of the German Navy and Air Force entered the room where Marshal Georgy Zhukov sat at the head of the Allied delegation. Keitel looked at Zhukov. He had been a senior officer of the Wehrmacht since before the war. He had signed execution orders. He had attended Hitler's military conferences for years, and now he stood in a damaged building in the rubble of the capital his army had started this war to dominate, facing a Russian marshal who had started it as a general of peasant origin. And he had no choice but to surrender. The documents were signed. The war in Europe was over. Zhukov had not merely participated in this victory. He had shaped it at nearly every critical moment. The defense of Moscow, the encirclement at Stalingrad, the counterattack at Kursk, the drive through Poland, the assault on Berlin. Eisenhower called him one of the greatest military commanders of the 20th century. Montgomery, the British commander who praised almost no one, expressed open admiration. Ordinary Soviet citizens, soldiers who had survived because of the decisions Zhukov made in staff rooms and at forward command posts, spoke his name with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. And none of this was lost on the man watching from the mausoleum. The trap has always been open. Here's the thing about Joseph Stalin that requires understanding before Part 3 can make any sense. He did not see the world in terms of gratitude. Gratitude was a weakness. Gratitude meant acknowledging that you needed someone, that your success depended, at least in part, on another human being. Stalin had spent his entire political life eliminating that dependency wherever he found it. He had shot men who had helped him rise. He had destroyed allies who knew too much about the compromises he had made. He had erased from photographs the faces of men he had once called comrades. In the state he had built, the only legitimate narrative of the war was one in which the Soviet people, guided by the genius of Stalin, had defeated fascism. Zhukov was not a villain in this narrative, but he was a complication. He was too real, too specific, too independently beloved to be absorbed cleanly into a story about the collective will of a nation led by one man. The more Zhukov won, the more complicated he became. June 24th, 1945, Red Square, the White Horse. Stalin watched the crowd roar. He watched Eisenhower and Montgomery, men who represented the power and prestige of the Western world, treat Zhukov as an equal. He watched his own soldiers look at Zhukov with an expression that they did not wear when they looked at Stalin. The parade of victory was the greatest day of Georgy Zhukov's life. It was also the last good day for a very long time. The countdown, which had been running since Stalingrad, had reached zero. There is a particular cruelty that history reserves for its greatest servants. The men who save nations are rarely allowed to enjoy the nations they saved. The summer of 1945 should have been Georgy Zhukov's moment of rest. He had earned it in a way that no accounting system could properly measure. 4 years of war, hundreds of decisions, each one carrying the weight of thousands of lives, sleepless nights at forward command posts, arguments with the most dangerous man in the Soviet Union, the slow, grinding, blood-soaked work of turning the tide of the largest conflict in human history. He was 50 years old. He was the most decorated soldier in the Soviet Union. He was, arguably, the most respected military commander alive on the face of the earth. He had approximately 12 months before everything collapsed. The machinery of his destruction was already in motion before the ink dried on the German surrender documents. It did not announce itself. It did not arrive with shouting or accusations or public theater. It moved quietly through back channels and whispered conversations in offices he was never invited into. The way all truly dangerous things move in systems built on absolute power. Stalin had a problem. The problem had a name, 4 gold stars, and a white horse. The aviator's affair. Fabricating a crime, 1946. The war had been over for less than a year. Air Marshal Alexander Novikov, the commander of Soviet air forces during the war, a man who had served alongside Zhukov and whose forces had supported the great offensives from Stalingrad to Berlin, was arrested by the Ministry of State Security. What followed was a process that anyone who had studied Soviet judicial practice in the 30s would have recognized immediately. Novikov was subjected to intense psychological and physical pressure. He was not given sleep. He was isolated. He was told repeatedly that the only way to help himself was to help the investigation, and that helping the investigation meant providing testimony against others. After weeks of this treatment, Novikov signed a document. The document alleged that Marshal Georgy Zhukov had systematically claimed personal credit for military operations that had been won through the collective genius of the Soviet command structure, meaning, in the official interpretation, through the guiding wisdom of Stalin himself. The document alleged arrogance, self-promotion, and disloyalty. None of it was credibly substantiated by independent evidence. But in the Soviet system of this era, independent evidence was not the point. The point was the signed statement. Zhukov was summoned before the Supreme Military Council. The charges were read. The assembled generals, men who had served with Zhukov, who knew the truth of what he had done and who had done it, sat in silence. Not one of them spoke in his defense with the force the moment required. They had all seen what happened to men who defended the accused in rooms like this one. Zhukov did not break. He did not weep or beg. He defended himself with the same direct plainness that had always characterized him, denying the most serious charges while acknowledging certain minor errors of judgment in a calculated attempt to appear cooperative, without surrendering the essential truth. Stalin, who presided over the proceedings, did something unexpected. He did not order Zhukov's arrest. He did something worse. He sent him to Odessa. Erasure, the Invisible Man, Odessa Military District, a backwater command, far from Moscow, far from power, far from everything that had defined Zhukov's life. For a man of Zhukov's energy, intellect, and history, this was not merely a professional demotion. It was a kind of psychological sentence, the military equivalent of being placed in a glass box and told to watch the world from inside it. powerless to affect anything, but the demotion was only the visible part. The deeper punishment was quieter and in many ways more damaging. Systematic erasure from the historical record. His name began to disappear from official accounts of the war. Newspapers that had once printed his photograph on their front pages stopped mentioning him at all. Books about the great battles of the Eastern Front were revised, his role minimized, credited to collective command, or attributed to Stalin's personal strategic direction. Paintings depicting the victory parade were altered. Some versions showed a different figure on the white horse, or no specific figure at all. In the official mythology of the Soviet state, the man who had defended Moscow, planned Stalingrad, and accepted Germany's surrender was becoming a ghost. Not a villain. That would have required acknowledging his existence, simply a space where a man used to be. This was Stalin's particular genius for cruelty. He understood that execution created martyrs, but erasure created nothing at all. You cannot mourn a person. History pretends never mattered. The Bag Under the Bed, 1948, brought a new wave of pressure. Soviet security services produced evidence, genuine evidence this time, that Zhukov had transported a substantial quantity of valuables and luxury goods from Germany following the war. Furniture, artwork, textiles, jewelry. The official term was trophy property. The implied accusation was looting. By the standards being applied selectively in those years, the charge was not wholly without basis. Many Soviet officers had acquired German property in the chaos of the final weeks of the war. But those officers were not Zhukov. The charge against others was overlooked. The charge against Zhukov was prosecuted. He wrote a letter of confession to Stalin. In measured, carefully chosen words, he acknowledged the impropriety of certain acquisitions, declared his absolute loyalty to the Soviet state, and expressed personal devotion to the supreme commander. It was the kind of letter that cost a proud man more than any external punishment could. The internal price of self-abasement before a man he did not respect. It did not fully satisfy his enemies, but it was enough to prevent the worst outcome. He was transferred again, further from Moscow this time, to the Ural military district. Even more remote, even more irrelevant. In his memoirs, written years later, Zhukov described that period with a sentence that has stayed in historical memory precisely because of its terrible practical specificity. He wrote that throughout 1947 he went to bed each night expecting to be arrested before morning, and that he kept a bag packed with underwear and basic necessities beside his bed, ready for the moment they came for him. Read that sentence again. The man who had kept 3 million soldiers in motion across a front stretching thousands of miles. The man who had sat across a table from the commanders of Nazi Germany and watched them surrender. He kept a packed bag under his bed. This is what Stalin's system did to the people it could not kill without consequences. It made them live in the permanent shadow of a fear they could not name aloud, surrounded by a silence no one dared break. Death as liberation. March 5th, 1953. Moscow. Joseph Stalin died. The official cause was a stroke. The circumstances surrounding his final days have been debated by historians ever since. There is evidence he lay unattended for many hours before his inner circle was willing to acknowledge the seriousness of his condition. A delay that may have been negligence or may have been something more deliberate. The men who surrounded him in those final hours, Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Molotov, all had reasons to calculate rather than to rush. When the news was announced, people wept in the streets of Moscow. Some of the weeping was genuine grief, the grief of those who had truly believed in the official mythology and felt their world's foundation crack. Some of it was performance, the automatic reflex of people who had learned to express the correct emotion in public regardless of what they felt privately. And some of the people weeping were weeping from something entirely different, relief. The particular overwhelming, breath-catching relief of the released. Zhukov received the news in the Urals. He was back in Moscow within weeks. Part 3. The Fall and the Legacy. The price of survival, the morning after victory. There is a particular cruelty that history reserves for its greatest servants, The men who saved nations are rarely allowed to enjoy the nations they saved. The summer of 1945 should have been Georgy Zhukov's moment of rest. He had earned it in a way that no accounting system could properly measure. 4 years of war, hundreds of decisions, each one carrying the weight of thousands of lives, sleepless nights at forward command posts, arguments with the most dangerous man in the Soviet Union, the slow, grinding, blood-soaked work of turning the tide of the largest conflict in human history. He was 50 years old. He was the most decorated soldier in the Soviet Union. He was, arguably, the most respected military commander alive on the face of the earth. He had approximately 12 months before everything collapsed. The machinery of his destruction was already in motion before the ink dried on the German surrender documents. It did not announce itself. It did not arrive with shouting or accusations or public theater. It moved quietly through back channels and whispered conversations in offices he was never invited into. The way all truly dangerous things move in systems built on absolute power. Stalin had a problem. The problem had a name, 4 gold stars, and a white horse. The aviator's affair, fabricating a crime, 1946. The war had been over for less than a year. Air Marshal Alexander Novikov, the commander of Soviet air forces during the war, a man who had served alongside Zhukov and whose forces had supported the great offensives from Stalingrad to Berlin, was arrested by the Ministry of State Security. What followed was a process that anyone who had studied Soviet judicial practice in the 30s would have recognized immediately. Novikov was subjected to intense psychological and physical pressure. He was not given sleep. He was isolated. He was told repeatedly that the only way to help himself was to help the investigation, and that helping the investigation meant providing testimony against others. After weeks of this treatment, Novikov signed a document. The document alleged that Marshal Georgy Zhukov had systematically claimed personal credit for military operations that had been won through the collective genius of the Soviet command structure, meaning, in the official interpretation, through the guiding wisdom of Stalin himself. The document alleged arrogance, self-promotion, and disloyalty. None of it was credibly substantiated by independent evidence, but in the Soviet system of this era, independent evidence was not the point. The point was the signed statement. Zhukov was summoned before the Supreme Military Council. The charges were read. The assembled generals, men who had served with Zhukov, who knew the truth of what he had done and who had done it, sat in silence. Not one of them spoke in his defense with the force the moment required. They had all seen what happened to men who defended the accused in rooms like this one. Zhukov did not break. He did not weep or beg. He defended himself with the same direct plainness that had always characterized him, denying the most serious charges, while acknowledging certain minor errors of judgment in a calculated attempt to appear cooperative without surrendering the essential truth. Stalin, who presided over the proceedings, did something unexpected. He did not order Zhukov's arrest. He did something worse. He sent him to Odessa, Erasure, the Invisible Man Odessa Military District, a backwater command, far from Moscow, far from power, far from everything that had defined Zhukov's life. For a man of Zhukov's energy, intellect, and history, this was not merely a professional demotion. It was a kind of psychological sentence, the military equivalent of being placed in a glass box and told to watch the world from inside it, powerless to affect anything. But the demotion was only the visible part. The deeper punishment was quieter and in many ways more damaging. Systematic erasure from the historical record. His name began to disappear from official accounts of the war. Newspapers that had once printed his photograph on their front pages stopped mentioning him at all. Books about the great battles of the Eastern Front were revised, his role minimized, credited to collective command or attributed to Stalin's personal strategic direction. Paintings depicting the victory parade were altered. Some versions showed a different figure on the white horse, or no specific figure at all. In the official mythology of the Soviet state, the man who had defended Moscow, planned Stalingrad, and accepted Germany's surrender was becoming a ghost, not a villain. That would have required acknowledging his existence. simply a space where a man used to be. This was Stalin's particular genius for cruelty. He understood that execution created martyrs, but erasure created nothing at all. You cannot mourn a person. History pretends never mattered. The bag under the bed. 1948 brought a new wave of pressure. Soviet security services produced evidence, genuine evidence this time, that Zhukov had transported a substantial quantity of valuables and luxury goods from Germany following the war. Furniture, artwork, textiles, jewelry. The official term was trophy property. The implied accusation was looting. By the standards being applied selectively in those years, the charge was not wholly without basis. Many Soviet officers had acquired German property in the chaos of the final weeks of the war. But those officers were not Zhukov. The charge against others was overlooked. The charge against Zhukov was prosecuted. He wrote a letter of confession to Stalin. In measured, carefully chosen words, he acknowledged the impropriety of certain acquisitions, declared his absolute loyalty to the Soviet state, and expressed personal devotion to the supreme commander. It was the kind of letter that cost a proud man more than any external punishment could, the internal price of self-abasement before a man he did not respect. It did not fully satisfy his enemies, but it was enough to prevent the worst outcome. He was transferred again, further from Moscow this time, to the Ural military district, even more remote, even more irrelevant. In his memoirs, written years later, Zhukov described that period with a sentence that has stayed in historical memory precisely because of its terrible practical specificity. He wrote that throughout 1947, he went to bed each night expecting to be arrested before morning, and that he kept a bag packed with underwear and basic necessities beside his bed, ready for the moment they came for him. Read that sentence again. The man who had kept 3 million soldiers in motion across a front stretching thousands of miles, the man who had sat across a table from the commanders of Nazi Germany and watched them surrender. He kept a packed bag under his bed. This is what Stalin's system did to the people it could not kill without consequences. It made them live in the permanent shadow of a fear they could not name aloud, surrounded by a silence no one dared break. Death as Liberation, March 5th, 1953. Moscow. Joseph Stalin died. The official cause was a stroke. The circumstances surrounding his final days have been debated by historians ever since. There is evidence he lay unattended for many hours before his inner circle was willing to acknowledge the seriousness of his condition, a delay that may have been negligence or may have been something more deliberate. The men who surrounded him in those final hours, Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Molotov, all had reasons to calculate rather than to rush. When the news was announced, people wept in the streets of Moscow. Some of the weeping was genuine grief, the grief of those who had truly believed in the official mythology and felt their world's foundation crack. Some of it was performance, the automatic reflex of people who had learned to express the correct emotion in public regardless of what they felt privately. And some of the people weeping were weeping from something entirely different, relief, the particular overwhelming, breath-catching relief of the released. Zhukov received the news in the Urals. He was back in Moscow within weeks. The arrest of the monster. The new Soviet leadership, a collective that had not yet sorted itself into the hierarchy it would eventually become, faced an immediate problem. The security apparatus that Stalin had built, the Ministry of State Security with its vast network of informants, interrogators, and detention facilities, was controlled by Lavrenti Beria. Beria was, by any assessment, the most dangerous figure in the post-Stalin landscape. He had personally overseen the machinery of the purge. He knew where every skeleton was buried, literally. He had files on everyone. He was already maneuvering for supreme power with the confidence of a man who believed that information and terror were sufficient substitutes for legitimacy. The other members of the collective leadership understood that if Beria was not stopped, he would eventually eliminate them one by one. They needed someone they could trust to carry out the arrest, someone with the physical presence, the military authority, and the sheer personal courage to walk into a room with Beria and make the arrest stick, knowing that Beria's security personnel were everywhere and that the operation would have no second chance, they chose Zhukov. In June 1953, Georgy Zhukov, the man who had been sleeping with a packed bag beside his bed 6 years earlier, walked into a meeting of the Council of Ministers and placed Lavrenti Beria under arrest. He did it with the same flat, direct manner he had used for everything else in his life. No ceremony, no hesitation. Beria reportedly was too stunned to resist. Beria was subsequently tried, found guilty of crimes against the state, and executed. The man who had helped build the system that nearly destroyed Zhukov was gone, and Zhukov once again was necessary. The pattern repeats. By 1955, Zhukov was Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union, the highest military post in the country, second in national authority only to the party leadership itself. Nikita Khrushchev, who had emerged as the dominant figure in the post-Stalin collective leadership, understood what Zhukov represented, military legitimacy that no civilian politician could replicate or purchase. When a group of Politburo members, Molotov, Malenkov, Kaganovich, and others, attempted to remove Khrushchev from power in June 1957 through a majority vote of the Council of Ministers, it was Zhukov who moved decisively. He arranged military transport to fly regional Communist Party first secretaries to Moscow, men who supported Khrushchev and whose votes would shift the balance, bypassing the normal civilian channels that the coup organizers controlled. He reportedly told the Presidium in the direct manner that was his lifetime trademark that the army would not support the removal. The attempted coup collapsed. Khrushchev survived. The men who had tried to remove him were expelled from power, sent to distant postings, stripped of influence. Zhukov had saved Khrushchev as surely as he had helped save the Soviet state during the war. He had placed his personal authority and institutional leverage on the line at a moment of genuine political crisis. 4 months later, Khrushchev fired him. The announcement came while Zhukov was on an official visit to Yugoslavia. He returned to Moscow to find that a Central Committee plenum had been convened in his absence, and that in that plenum, where he was not present to speak in his own defense, the charges had already been prepared, and the verdict already decided. The charge this time was that Zhukov had encouraged a cult of personality around himself within the military, and that he had sought to build the army as a power base, independent of party oversight. The irony of the first charge, made by a man who had spent years carefully dismantling Stalin's cult of personality, was apparently lost on no one present, or perhaps was simply too dangerous to acknowledge aloud. Zhukov was stripped of all positions. He was removed from the Central Committee. He was retired from the military with full pension and formal honors. Khrushchev, unlike Stalin, did not want a martyr, but effectively silenced and marginalized. The pattern had repeated itself, a second time in a different key, with a different conductor, but the same essential composition. Zhukov becomes indispensable. Zhukov saves the leadership. The leadership, precisely because it needs him, fears him. The leadership removes him. He was 61 years old. He had served the Soviet state for more than 40 years. He had saved it at least twice. He would never hold a position of authority again. The book They Tried to Tame Zhukov spent the remaining years of his active life writing. The memoirs took nearly a decade. He worked on them through the early and middle 1960s in the enforced quiet of his retirement. A large, comfortable apartment and a country dacha, the material comforts of a hero, the political invisibility of an exile. He wanted to tell the truth. He wrote about the catastrophic failures of the first weeks of the war, the ignored warnings, the paralysis at the top, the unnecessary deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. He wrote about the moments when Stalin had been wrong and he had said so. He wrote about the gaps between the official mythology of the war and the reality he had lived and witnessed. The censors went through the manuscript with systematic thoroughness. Passages criticizing Stalin were removed. Assessments of strategic errors at the highest level were softened or deleted. The passages most dangerous to the official narrative those that showed the war's victory as something won by specific men making specific choices at enormous personal risk, rather than as the inevitable expression of Soviet collective will, were cut entirely. When the book was published in 1969, it was simultaneously a landmark and a compromise. Landmark because it was Zhukov, the actual man who had actually done these things, speaking directly. Compromise because the man speaking had been partially silenced before the words reached the page. Readers who knew enough to read between the lines could sense the spaces where the real testimony had been. The book became an immediate sensation. Readers across the Soviet Union and internationally devoured it. In a country where the war was the central experience of the generation, hearing the account of the man who had shaped it most decisively carried an emotional weight that nothing else could replicate. Zhukov was old by then. He had suffered a significant heart attack in 1967, which had slowed him considerably. He lived simply, received occasional visitors, and moved through the careful, reduced life of a man whose great years were conclusively behind him. June 18, 1974, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov died on June 18, 1974. He was 77 years old. The Soviet government, by then led by Leonid Brezhnev, who had his own relationship with the war's mythology and his own political reasons to be careful about how heroes were commemorated, granted him state funeral honors. He was buried in the Kremlin Wall necropolis in Red Square, the highest funerary honor the Soviet state could bestow, the resting place of Lenin and other figures of supreme official standing. He had received 4 gold stars designating Hero of the Soviet Union, a number no other person in Soviet history ever matched. He held the Order of Victory twice. He had been decorated by the governments of the United States, Great Britain, France, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Mongolia, and others. By any formal measurement the Soviet state possessed for quantifying military distinction, the measurements had run out of room for everything Zhukov had earned. And yet at the end, the most honest monument to his life was not any medal or any ceremony. It was the packed bag beside the bed, the bronze man on Manezhnaya Square. Today, on Manezhnaya Square, directly outside the Kremlin walls in Moscow, a bronze equestrian statue of Georgy Zhukov stands on its pedestal. He's mounted as he was on June 24, 1945. The horse is captured mid-stride. Zhukov's face, rendered in metal, carries the same expression visible in the photographs from that day. Not triumph, not relief, but something quieter and more durable. The expression of a man who has done what needed to be done. Below the statue, every year on Victory Day, May 9th, people bring flowers. Not because the government tells them to, because they want to. Think about what that statue represents and where the man inside it began. A village of no consequence, 62 miles from Moscow. A father who repaired shoes, a mother who carried grain, a boy who completed 3 years of school and considered it an achievement, who slept on a workshop floor at 11 years old, who was handed a horse and a rifle in 1915 and discovered in the chaos of the Eastern Front that he possessed something the Empire had never given him and could not take away, an ability to see clearly when everything around him was on fire. He rose through a revolution that promised to dissolve the barriers of birth, survived a purge that destroyed nearly every other officer of his generation, won battles that changed the direction of history, accepted the surrender of the most powerful military machine Europe had ever assembled, and then watched, with that same clarity that had always defined him, as the system he had served used his very victories as the instrument of his humiliation. He was never destroyed. That was the final, essential fact. Stalin tried to erase him and failed, because the truth of what Zhukov had done was too large and too specific to be erased. Khrushchev tried to sideline him permanently and failed, because history does not accommodate that kind of editing indefinitely. The censors took passages out of his memoir, but they could not take the memoir's existence, or the man's existence, or the reality of what the man had done. In the end, the boy from Strelkovka outlasted them all. He outlasted Stalin by 21 years. He outlasted the Soviet Union itself. at least in memory and monument. The greatest armies in history have always been led by men who came from nowhere and built everything with their hands. Zhukov was that man, at that scale, in the century of total war. No origin story prepared him for it. No system protected him during it. No authority rewarded him fairly after it. He was simply, stubbornly, relentlessly himself, from the workshop floor to the white horse to the packed bag to the bronze statue. And history, which has a long memory and a poor tolerance for erasure, eventually gave him back everything they tried to take away.